Oh, yeah, I got something to show you. Remember this book, River Runs Through It? You find out the more you learn about any sort of author or anything that there's other fans, but with this book, I mean, there's like super fans. So a biography recently came out called Norman MacLean, Rivers and Letters, I think it is. And through that, I realized not only do people want to keep learning about the author today, but there's even reviewers in the New York Times who are even bigger super fans than the biographer, the one that wrote the story, the biography of Norman MacLean. And there's like a competition on who likes him more, I find that interesting because they don't do that with every author. Maybe Cormac McCarthy gets that, I don't know. But you'd think, like, it's a short novella, right? Like, how good could it be? And to me, it's phenomenal, right? Yeah, it's phenomenal. But this book led me to another book that has become one of my favorite books. And it was kind of interesting how that happened. Got hair in my mouth. Now, typically with like any writer post 1920, 1930, you're gonna get the question of who is their influence. That usually harkens back to a fork in the road, a literary fork in the road between Hemingway and Faulkner. I turn it like that because the books make his head, In fact, when I put him out of place, it's like I can't focus. I'm like, that's guys, I got a freak face. I love when they do that. If you don't know about the Hemingway-Faulkner dilemma, let me just kind of explain it. Both phenomenally great writers, but both very different when it comes to content they wrote about as well as how they write. So Hemingway, limited vocabulary, short sentence structure, tight prose, but he can produce such great imagery. Faulkner's the opposite. He writes short, very long, complicated sentences, uses words that are complicated. He writes in this kind of stop-go way, so kind of how I'm talking, where I'll be like, oh, hey, how you guys doing today? I forgot to feed the chickens. Chicken soup for dinner? Now, that's nothing like Faulkner, but the feeling that you just got is how you're going to feel when you read Faulkner. He has a sense of where the narrator allows themselves to have inward thoughts. It's incredibly deep. The point of this really is, though, any writer usually will say Hemingway or Faulkner. So Jim Harrison, like all the interviews I ever saw of him, he was pro Faulkner. It's like the Twilight dilemma. He was team Faulkner. Like Donna Tartt, she's pro Hemingway. She's pro Hemingway, and she studied his prose like with an X-Acto knife. So that's the question I always have for people: is who is it? Who's gonna be? Who's it gonna be? Where do I stand? I mean, who cares where I stand, right? You're not reading any of my great novels yet. Hopefully one day, maybe. I don't know. I like them both. I do lean more towards Faulkner. He writes like he has ADHD, but aware of it, and he can still be incredibly precise. It so matches the way my brain works that after I've read his books, they match so well with kind of like the rhythm of my mind that I forget they're not my memories. When I'm talking about my past to someone or I'll almost say the story, or I'll say a moment of maybe that didn't happen to me. Just because of that, he kind of nailed my mind. So that's how I am. So when I wanted to go deeper into the making of this book and how he wrote it, I wanted to know, was he a Hemingway guy or was he a Faulkner guy, or did he maybe spend more of his time with poets? I didn't know what he did. And in an interview he did, he mentioned both Faulkner and Hemingway, but he mentioned someone else that was far more important in his writing. So in this interview, Norman MacLean is asked this question by the interviewer. Where did you learn to tell stories? When I was young in the West, most of us thought we were storytellers. And of course we worshipped Charlie Russell, partly for his paintings, but also because he was a wonderful storyteller. I feel I learned as much about storytelling from him as I did Mark Twain or Wordsworth or any other professional writer. The tradition behind that, of course, was old cowboy tradition, coming into a town with a paycheck, putting up in a hotel, and sitting around with a half dozen other guys trying to out-tell each other in stories. Whoever was voted as telling the best story had all his expenses paid for the weekend. I learned as much, even technically, about storytelling from Charlie Russell's stories as I did, say, from Hemingway. He, Russell, was still alive and kicking until I was in my 20s. He was an idol in Montana, much more so than now. He's an idol now, of course, too, but then we worshipped him, and with good cause. His stories are only 2 to 10 pages long, but if you want to learn how to handle action economically and just have every sentence jumping with stuff, take a look at him. Marvelous storyteller. A volume of his called Trails Plowed Under is just a miraculous piece of narration. Good title, isn't it? The title pervades not only his paintings, but all of his stories. All the time he was writing and painting, he had this feeling that the West that I knew is gone. There's always a nostalgia hanging over his paintings and stories. Now, if you don't know who Charlie Russell is, let me tell you a little bit about him. In Montana, Charlie Russell is the god of art. He moved here in the late 1800s with the dream of becoming a cowboy. He had a lot of talent that he wasn't aware of. What he ended up becoming was a cowpuncher. He lived the real cowboy life. One day, as he was on a job which isn't as glamorous in reality as it was in movies, he was out in the distance, staying for a lengthy time with these cattle, and he received a letter from the head cowboy asking how the cows are doing. Well, Charlie Russell was not a good writer. In fact, he didn't finish high school. He was very anxious, nervous kind of person. He didn't have any confidence in himself. And so when he had to respond, he didn't feel like he should write it because he was going to embarrass himself. So what he did is he got out a piece of paper and a pencil, and he sketched out what the cow looked like. You could see the ribs in the cow. And he sent back the drawing to let them know the cows aren't doing good. When they received this drawing, they right away understood without any words what was going on. And they took the drawing and posted it in the local bar. And they all said, "Oh, I love this drawing." Well, by the time he came back, he was kind of gaining a reputation as an artist. Around this time, he goes and meets Nancy Russell, who is from Helena, Montana. She was raised very poor. She lived in a time of, I think, tuberculosis. Is that what it was? And I think she had it when she was younger. She survived. But because of the way she was raised, she never devalued what she had. So when she met Charlie Russell, she saw all this talent, but all this lack of ambition, where she had all this ambition and not the tools. So they started dating, got married, and she became like his literary agent. And she started pitching him everywhere. But what was interesting is that his wife was such a pistol. She would get him into magazines. And she would send his art to magazines, and then she would say, and he's going to write a story for it. And they said, "Oh, he can't write. We've seen him write. He doesn't know how to write." She wouldn't respond with an argument. She would just say, "Okay, so I'll send him his writings. You'll pay us this much, and that's the way it's going to be." And so many magazines, big magazines, were afraid of her. They just did it. And all these stories over time they're called the Rawhide series, I think. And they got put into a book later called Trails Plowed Under by Charlie Russell. Now, something that's interesting to know is that if you go on to Google and look up your state capitol building, every state capitol has 2 representatives that represent the state, not representatives like we vote for, but 2 historical representatives that represent the state. Montana is the only state that has an artist, a painting person, as the representative, and it's Charlie Russell. So if you come to Montana and you come to the state of Montana and you go to our Capitol building, you'll see a big statue of Charlie Russell. He's the only one that has this in all the United States. So he has a very high place in our, not only in our state, but in our country. So finding this book, I was incredibly interested, obviously, after hearing about how much it influenced Norman Maclean over Hemingway and Faulkner. I was like, how can this guy who's basically illiterate be a better writer than Hemingway? This is something that I try to tell people about art, that quality's great, but then put it in your backpack, or your back pocket, or your pocket, or in the back seat, and focus on narration. Think of it like this. Do you have to know how to read music in order to be a good singer? No. Learning to read music will come secondary to your ability, your voice, right? People should have their ears open for good storytelling. Now, the craft is something you should focus on, but it's not necessarily going to make you a good writer. Just as much as if you become a proficient guitar player, you're not going to become a great songwriter. Those are 2 totally different things. So this contains all of his short stories over those years. And they're stories that he heard as he's a cowboy from other cowboys coming through town, at bars and or at pubs and just out on the road, out in the campfire kind of place. And he retold them in the way he remembered it. So what happened to me after I read this? Well, I picked this up just so I can have some sort of familiarity with, what the heck a good writer would think good writing is. Books beget books. I don't know. I made that up, I think. So this is a great book, but I usually pull this book out when people come over and I know they're readers, and I'll just pull it out and I'll just flip to whatever and just say, hey, read that real quick. So like my aunt visited this last summer and I had her just start reading one of the stories, and she couldn't stop laughing. And I'm like, I know these are incredibly funny, they're incredibly short, and they have some of the best endings I've ever read. I'm always shocked by every ending to the story. I just think of any book that I'm going to recommend to anyone, especially if they're an avid reader, they like westerns, they like humor, they like short stories, any of that stuff, this is going to be probably the number one book. This book is great. That's all I got to say.